Hello, Michael. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Paul, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Okay, brilliant. Michael, the reason why I've invited you on with me today is because my live stream show, The History CV of Britain, has recently been focusing on our ancient past, from the megalithic culture through to Druidism and the early Chaldean church in Britain, and onto the historicity of King Arthur. Throughout our investigations, I've come across some fascinating authors like yourself, Anna Wilkes, Conwyn Beaumont, Conor McDarry, and Godfrey Higgins, to name but a few, who I've termed the outliers of history, and we'll focus in on those authors shortly. But first, Michael, I know you have many interests, which you've expressed through your extensive writings and videos. But confining yourself, please, to the ancient history space, what is the main thesis you can give us?
Yeah, well, there you go. That's the premise, the underlying premise of my work, and it certainly does make me 100% different than most of all the other writers on this subject in the modern age. And that is that I adhere to the idea that the elements of civilization moved from the west to the east and not the other way around. And that makes it then unique. The last person to ever speak about that was probably Commons Beaumont, the great Commons Beaumont. I'm certainly a disciple of him, but that was back in the 1960s. So after he passed away, this subject and thesis utterly fell by the wayside, and not a single person has touched it. So this is, I would say, answers that question.
Okay, brilliant. I've recently read Irish Wisdom Preserved in the Bible and Pyramids by Conor McDarry. I've also read The Great Deception by Conwyn Beaumont, which I found absolutely fascinating. They were just amazing to read. My main problem with these books is that there are no sources provided. There's no bibliography that I can find. So it's very difficult trying to research the information that these authors have imparted in their books. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I'd say that, first of all, they're not the only ones who had that foible. There are innumerable books, similar books, and others even of more fame and prestige in the world that also lack these citations. It can be frustrating for us in the modern world, but you see, you've got to, I think the way that I personally dealt with it, and this also, by the way, just let me throw in, this would include great writers like L.A. Waddell, who I also am a follower of, and others that we might get to talk about, because, or like, say, Immanuel Velikovsky. There's a whole slew of writers like this. But how I've got used to that is because, you see, there's two kinds of communication, and there's two kinds of knowledge in terms of what consciousness is. There's what the Greeks called nous, which is the mental, but there's also this lesser known one called cardias. Sorry to have to dip into philosophy here to answer the question, but I think it's very valuable. And cardias is the knowledge of the heart. And therefore, these men that you're talking about are outliers. You got that right. But they're also outliers because they're trying to communicate not to this rational left brain, which we're all trained in, all indoctrinated in, and all too familiar with, sometimes too much. So they're speaking on another dimension. The proof that we need when we're reading their work is a proof that's written in our own scriptorium, in this archive of blood that we have within our own being, i.e. the racial memory. They're speaking to that. Many great works do. In fact, all poetry does, and all bardic and druidic. You mentioned them earlier. Well, what do you think that was? A lot of people say it was an oral tradition. Well, we could argue about that, whether it was or whether it was not. But even if they wrote things down, and they actually did write things down, they wrote on leaves, which is why we even still today use the word leaves of a book, is because the Druids did write. They had a kind of runic writing, or something we would now know as Ogham, for instance, and it was written on leaves, and then they were tied together into early books. So they did write. It wasn't just oral. But back to my point, the whole idea is they weren't speaking to some mental left brain. I've got to run to another misguided author to get his citation on it. That's for our world.
Mm.
So the Conor McDarries were doing something very, very different, as was Anna Wilkes, as was Connor Commons Beaumont. Now, we don't have to like it. So what I say about it is that really the footnoter is ourselves. We still have to pursue this knowledge. We have to digest it in a certain way that's not just on a mental level, another intellectual thing to be putting on the shelf. You've got to look at this information by people at McDarry as if you found an ancient scroll, something bloody precious, something of a relic. You've got to think of yourself like a Heinrich Schliemann, in Troy, you see, or Dr. Kramer in terms of the Sumerian digs, or L.A. Waddell. You've got to think of yourself as an ancient archaeologist coming across a manuscript, like say the Orinda book, or the Colburn Bible, or the Book of Enoch. That's how those things don't have citations.
True.
So we have citations, yes, and that's a needed thing, and I'm for it, and I like it, and sometimes it's important to pursue that. But there's another part of us that's been long neglected. So I know that's a philosophical answer, but that's what I would say first. Now, there's another answer, if I can squeeze this in.
Of course.
And that is that when you pull back from the canvas of the whole subject that you and I are studying, and you need to do this from time to time, there's something that happens that helps answer this kind of question, and others like what you've asked. And that is, are we as evolved today in our technological and educated world as we imagine ourselves to be, that we've conditioned ourselves into be? You see, the Platos of the world, they don't believe so. And neither did the Commons Beaumonts or Conor McDarries, like you're talking about. In fact, they were part, not only, but they were part of a group of people who believed that we've actually devolved. Today, we would have somebody like Michael Cremo, who explicitly, the wonderful writings of Michael Cremo help to, underline this. But you have others as well. Well, these are the kind of people that we're dealing with. They believe that the whole human race has completely devolved. And although we have mind controlled and talked ourselves in the 19th century, or since the Industrial Revolution anyway, into this idea that we're so technologically and intellectually advanced. And then that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? As far as we're concerned, we are. And that's the end of it. You're not going to talk anybody out of that. But there's another kind of perspective in the world, Paul, and that's what I think they're doing. They're referring to the fact that no. Culturally, spiritually, and in other ways, we have very much devolved. Now, what this means, of course, is that there must have been a high civilization, or more than one, in the ancient times. Call it Atlantis or whatever you like to call it. And that's what these Conor McDarries are referring to. They're referring to a time in which civilizations like the ancient Irish and what have you, but it's not restricted to that, were more advanced. That's what they're really talking about. And they're trying to speak about that. And there won't be any footnotes. There is no archaeology. It's all been destroyed by the age of catastrophe. And they've taken that for granted. And so they're speaking to the human race and saying, can you grasp this fact? And if you do, then a lot of things are going to change in your thinking in your life. You've got to go backwards and ask some very peculiar questions about then what kind of races are we talking about? What kind of knowledge did they have? Where did they get it? And was there even some off-world, say, like we would say today, paranormal perspective on this? Again, that we could argue about that. But the whole premise of our traditions now change. I mean, sometimes completely when you do this inverse thing. So then Ireland becomes important, and then you get your Conor McDarries, jumping up on that because they want to emphasize the role of the West in general. I do too. I believe what they're saying is true. But it doesn't restrict it only to that. In my work, I've gone on to talk about Atlantis. I've talked about the thing called the Arctic homeland, which I think is the real reference, that when you speak about Atlantis, that's what you're talking about, is the fall of the Arctic homeland, a concept that, again, has also fallen by the wayside. So this is the realm we're in. But the basic premise that answers your question is these men are speaking from a perspective that talks about high cultures. And then from that point, from that great gnosis, a tremendous fall, a tremendous devolution. And that you get the seeding of this wisdom throughout the world because their descendants, went into the world as Scythians or Armenians or Turks or whatever you want, and moved into the East and even into the Far East. We've got the seeding of their great knowledge from the West. Yes, but from that point, from those ages of catastrophe, it's been in decline. And so when they're looking at us right now, they're not looking to give us footnotes. They're looking to give us the premise, the main idea, so that we wake up again from this great spiritual coma that we're in. And this is then what I would say, to a question like yours. Once you get that, you can be more forgiving about their textual inadequacy, because now you see what they were motivated to do. Not fool us. Not they did not. They wrote their books in a certain way, not to malinger or to fool us in any way, but to provide information that's vital in this way that, say, a famous theosophist like Blavatsky would have understood that, oh my God, yes, that many of the Vedic people have talked about a great decline, that the Bible itself talks about, the pre-Adamic world, a state of consciousness that was higher, and we've devolved. Almost all the ancient cultures believe in this. But when we find it in the form of, what the books that you're talking about, it can feel a little peculiar, and it can rub us up the wrong way. And therefore, you need to have this background that I'm discussing right now, and that will help. That will help a lot, so that you don't discard these works at all, but actually hold them up in high esteem, like I myself have done.
Fantastic, thank you. There's a train of thought that we lost, or we started to devolve, if you like, as you've put it, when we found the written word. We invented the written word and started writing, because before then, memory was considered extremely important, being able to retell long stories, etc. And that's possibly somewhere where we maybe took the wrong turn. I don't know. But how important is it then for somebody like myself, when they're researching these topics, to be to focus in on their intuition and rely on that a lot more, perhaps, than citations and sources, etc.?
Yes, I think that is needed, because it's also needed in science. Let's remember how many famous top-level scientists of the Max Planck level, said that they had their greatest insights with a flash. Whole volumes have been written. Yeah, whole volumes have been written about this. You know that, right? You've heard it. Einstein said it. The Microsoft guys all said it. Steve Allen has said it. They've all said it. This is what I'm talking about. So I think it's vital. And it's not just vital in, say, a technical area or in any area of science. It's even more vital when you're dealing with even more subtle and controversial areas. And by the way, our refusal to do it, or let's say our conditioning, to not do it, has cost us a lot. When you pick up this theory of devolution, you see, it becomes very, very impactful, because then you realize what it means when you break it down is how retarded and truncated our civilization and our cultures have been throughout the world. All of them are included here. The West can't claim, some sort of extra advancement when you're talking on this level. That would be ridiculous, right? Because all of the cultures, even in the West, are far, far, far from what they should be. Hence all the gender wars, hence all the other, problems that we face, hence the kind of demagogues that we vote for, and all the other pestilences that we do, socially, politically, and what have you. So yes, the intuition is that which is trying to, as Carl Jung would have said, tap into this deeper mythical, shall we call it, reservoir that Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung and others have spoken about. So the intuition is that. It's nothing woo-woo. It's just we have this ancient archive within ourselves, and we have the intuition that attempts to tap into it, but unfortunately gets hijacked, by the intellect. And the intellect has given us a great deal, and so has the reason. And so we tend to always err on the side of that. We let it have too much reign. I'm for balancing the two, but unfortunately, most of the time we don't have that. And we certainly won't have it if the kind of education systems that we have continue to reign over our children. It'll just get more and more. It'll get less and less prominent. This kind of cognition.
Okay, thank you. Brilliant. Okay, Michael, you look to ancient mythologies worldwide as a deep archive of ancient knowledge to support your views that civilization was brought to indigenous peoples by white men. Can you tell us about this, and how does Atlantis fit in, and how far do you think are we going back?
Well, I think it's about between 13,500 years BC, which would take it up to about 15,000 from our time, is what you might be talking about when you aggregate all of the different accounts. And so, and for me, I'm not a big believer in Plato's description. I think it's valuable to a point, but I think I like better other accounts that talk about Hyperborea, Ultima Thule, Tula, Arctos, Polaria, Avalon, right? The Garden of Hesperides. This is the Arctic homeland. And the Arctic homeland had its colonies, which would have definitely included Britain, or at least northern Britain and Ireland as well. So this is how I look at it after the years of study. And that's all under ice now. So there's your evidence of a catastrophe and even the tilt of the earth. So there definitely was an Atlantis and there definitely was a fall. But then when you go to the next level and look sincerely at the pre-Celtic legends of Ireland, they make no bones about it that the savior of the race built ships to save his race during a time of great cataclysm. And the race were tall and fair, and they came to Ireland. So they would be the progenitors. And all Irish mythology and British mythology is based on this. So this is, and they were the Arya, basically, the progenitors that we know as the Arya. But a small detail, they came, they say, from the west or from the northwest in their ships from 4 destroyed islands or continents. Not just one. And of the 4, one of them was called Murias. Now, that is almost identical to the word Lemuria. And Le is obviously like the French, the.
Yeah.
So this was the motherland home. So at least one of these areas of the High Magi was called Murias. And I found that absolutely fascinating. And I also found it fascinating. Why would you say you've come from the West when anyone who looks at a map of Britain and Ireland knows that there's nothing out there in the West? So that means that there must have been something out there at one time. And even in the Northwest. So this becomes far more intriguing, right, than anything that Plato had to say. But one thing that Plato also says is that Atlantis was available through the Pillars of Hercules. And Commons Beaumont and the people I study adamantly said that those Pillars of Hercules were nothing less than the Giant's Causeway. Those basalt pillars on one side in Northern Ireland are also found diametrically opposite in Scotland. And they were known to ancient mariners as the Pillars of the Giants or the Pillars of Hercules. Wow. And when you passed through them, you were on your way to the continent of Atlantis, says Plato. So again, no mistaking about it. They're talking about Ultima Thule. They're talking about Hyperborea. That's what the symbolism relates to. Then I did a podcast called Arctic Homeland. And in it, we refer to a book. And in it, the author is Indian, Tilak. And he says that when you read the Vedas closely, it's absolutely replete with references to astronomical phenomena, conjunctions, famous alignments that happen in the heavens in the zodiac. But as Tilak says, none of those constellational aspects are visible from India, where allegedly these books were written, not even up in the Himalayas. So this then led some scholars, this is before, the British invasion over there, to start asking deep questions. Because the fact is that you have to be much farther north to even know about these particular celestial events. And other astronomers had actually, in my research, I've got all this research in my books, you see, that this was even mentioned by other famous astrologers of the West. Some of the actual conjunctions of the luminaries and other celestial events can't be seen from the latitudes of India. And so the Vedas must have originated in climes where you could have seen these, and these were well documented. Well, I'm afraid that is up in the Arctic Circle. And so this is then, where my work hinges, that the real ancient proto-civilization was in the Northwest, and it was a lost world. It fell. So the original Paradiso, the walled garden, the walled city, and that is in our racial memory when I talk about it. All fairy tales, children's legends, whatever, it's there, but it's in our right brain. It's in our deeper core, the memory of this kind of place. Now, it's well known that the Germans, the Anglo-Saxons, and those kinds of people all descended from Scandinavia originally. Their roots are up in the north. There's a phenomenon known as the Bok saga. Maybe you've come across that.
No, I haven't. Sorry.
Yes, please check that out. Bok, B-O-C-K saga, and these are the legends of Finland, and they will corroborate everything that I'm talking about, right? Because it's another remnant, and it actually got destroyed by the Catholic Church, in more of a later periods of time. After the Catholic Church had erected itself, it made a beeline for Finland, and a wreck and ruin took place there that has been scrubbed from history. But the same thing, if you've read your Conor McGonary's, you'll know that he also said the same thing happened in Ireland. Mm-hmm. But funnily enough, his work is backed up by the Bok saga of Finland, completely corroborated. So when you said that there wasn't any corroboration, there is. It's just you have to know where to go to look. And you have to do some deep digging, into other scholars. It's very, very important to bring all of these different people together. But I can certainly tell you that if you study the Bok saga, in a very short time, you'll find all the corroboration of people like Conor McGonaghy that you need, and to substantiate what he was talking about. And when it comes to people like Commons Beaumont, it's there as well. You just have to know where to look. So this all amounts to the fact that the ancient people knew about this Arctic homeland, and that the inhabitants of that had been forced out of their original habitats and into other lands. Now, it wasn't a race. Let's get that clear. There's no such thing as an Aryan race. This was a small caste, but their influence was enormous. Another proof of this, if you can look up the term, I can send this to you, the right spelling, Phineas Farsa, who had colleges. These are Western colleges, right? Irish colleges of language all over the planet. So the historians know all about this. And as a matter of fact, one of the members of the great colleges of Phineas Farsa was known as Abaris. And Abaris was a Scythian who traveled down to Greece and became the mentor of Pythagoras. And so if you read deeply into the Pythagorean works, they claim that their master is not Pythagoras, not a Greek, but a Scythian from the Northwest. So this whole idea that transit and emigration only happened exclusively from the east to the west, and as we've been taught it, is a fabrication. If Marco Polo could do it, if other scholars could do it, other historians and other great men could travel from the west to the east, from the east to the west and what have you, then of course it could happen in prehistoric days, and it did happen. Now, of course, you cannot then, your next question would simply be, would it not? Why do we not know this? How come that has been covered up? It seems such a normal, rational, intuitively logical thing to grasp. There couldn't be anything possibly controversial about it. Could there? Well, there must be. So now we're into the realm of the conspiracy, because, of course, yes, this information was not just forgotten. There's been a massive campaign through history, to cover this up. And that's why, again, my work has always been hinterlanded. All the wagons have been circled, as it was against these other people that we're talking about. And I've suffered it the same in my career as well. Nobody wants to know. They're stuck on what they're doing. And yeah, that's just the long and short of it, But I just plow on anyway, regardless.
Yeah, fantastic. Several questions are now bubbling in my mind. One of which would be places like Stonehenge and Avebury, for example, in this country, in Britain, and the Giza complex in Egypt. Are these sites remnants of Atlantis, or were they there as part of Atlantis, would you say?
I think you're right. I think they were. I think that even if Britain turns out to be a colony of the Arctic homeland, it makes no difference.
Mhm.
These beautiful megalithic cyclopean ruins are all over Scandinavia and the steppes of Russia, and also throughout Italy, France, Spain, and Ireland. And there were many, many thousands more than exist today. Most of them have been desecrated. That's why we are left with so little information. I believe they're a lot older, although some were built when the races that we're talking about made a return. After the age of catastrophe, when some sort of semblance of normality, came back to the Western lands, well, some of the descendants of the people we're talking about returned. And when they got back here, especially in Scotland, they start building new ones, and that accounts for the dating, difference. That there's some very, very old megaliths, and then there's a little bit what people have seen have been later in history. Well, this accounts for it. And obviously they were astronomical, but they probably had other purposes as well, to do with the healing of the earth. See, the West was always known, and even in Egyptian chronicles you get this, that it was called the land of the dead, the land where you didn't go, the land of ghouls, of mists, and of decay. That's how the West was. It was revered as the realm of the gods, but it was there was a taboo against going there, because of this wreck and ruin and the memory of it. The whole world, by the way, was shaken by the age of catastrophe, but it just turns out that these northern climes that we're talking about, Britain, Scotland, and the North and the Arctic, were particularly devastated, and the ancient world knew about it. Now, you see, the other thing is, there's a book, you were looking for corroboration. A really good book I can recommend you is by Ulf Erlingsson, the Norwegian geographer, and he wrote a book called Atlantis in Ireland. Atlantis in Ireland. My God, get it. Because he analyzes the latest satellite photographs, which of course in the ancient times they didn't have. And through that, he discovered the land bridges that existed not only between England and Ireland, but also between Scotland, northern England, and the continent. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So what this, of course, means is that Britain was not as remote in those early days as we would think of it later, when the sea is there. Yeah, that changes a lot of things as well. So there was more commerce, there was more travel. That all had to stop later on. But the ability for the British people to be able to travel away from those wrecked lands, we understand now how that can happen. And also, they had to make their way back later on. But of course, the journey was far more treacherous because now you had the water. So you have to bear all of this in mind as well. But nevertheless, many of them were returns. So I do not rule out the east to west movement as it has been written down. But I see those in my work as returns. But you just can't get this through the blockheads of the people in this movement today, or even in the academia. They just refuse it. Now, one day they'll come across the information, they'll dig it up. They're very close to that, which will then make this completely, it will enter into the mainstream. But boy, oh boy, it's certainly been resisted more than almost any other aspect of alternative history. This has been resisted. And now I know where to go to get the information from it. We're sharing a little bit of it here with you, but throughout my works, I present the case so far. Let's just call it that. And I think it's very convincing, and a lot of people really do see its validity. But of course, it will change everything. I mean, you talked about the pyramid there for a minute, and that's back to my original point. I mean, when you go there, and hundreds of thousands of tourists a year do so, what do you think is in their minds when they look at that? Surely, at least their minds are leaning toward what I spoke earlier when I talked about a devolution. That is the word that comes to your mind, or at least your your intuitive mind, when you stand in front of anything like that, or you go to Göbekli Tepe. You're completely not going to believe what you've been told in school. You're actually a complete idiot if you do.
Sorry, go on. I was going to say, I had that exact experience when I drove down the Bath Road for the first time about 20 years ago, turned a corner, and there in front of me was Silbury Hill. Oh my God. It's just massive, huge, great big thing sitting there. And I'd heard about it, but I'd never actually seen it before. And then when you see it in real life, you're just blown off your feet.
Isn't it?
It's just incredible.
Isn't that the way it is? Yeah, so
Yeah.
well said. And also, I got that when I went to Newgrange back in the early 80s. You're just flummoxed.
Yeah.
And you know that you've been handed a bill of goods by these tour guides and by all the nonsense. So now you may not buy into, I'm not saying that suddenly you're going to buy into the whole concept of devolution. No, you should never, jump on a bandwagon. Always. But what's happened is that your world has been shaken. And now at least you lean in the direction. And we're not talking about a few people. Hundreds of thousands of people go, sometimes not even a weekly or monthly basis to these things. And they are being converted. They are finding it interesting. And they will go and pursue, you see. So that's vital. Now so Atlantis really is a placeholder in the nomenclature. But I would rather break it down, talk about the Arctic homeland, the original Hyperboreans, and then, as I say, don't think that they were a race particularly, but they were a caste, and they were welcomed wherever they went. There's no such thing as an invasion. That was another lie that was brought about, like the Aryan invasion story. This is complete nonsense. The Aryan never invaded anywhere. They were welcomed in as gods, god kings, wherever they were. Satellite imagery also shows you the complexes even as far away as northern India. So the groups that we're talking about got to Turkey, to Anatolia, where they had a massive civilization, a massive center that's also been airbrushed. And this would involve, Cappadocia and Göbekli Tepe and Armenia. That's all been scrubbed from history. Nobody wants to talk about that.
Oh, yeah.
And then, as the satellite photographs have shown, they got to the Indus Valley, to Pamir and to the Indus Valley. And the scholars were astonished, gobsmacked, to find out how many millions of settlements and homes, were along these great rivers. Now, most of those rivers have dried up. There's been desiccation, there's been desertification, but the satellite photographs don't lie. There was massive Aryan civilizations, and none of it was by conquest. Because wherever these people went, they brought skills, you see, that were desperately needed by the people that they met. There was very little resistance because the whole world knew of them. The whole world knew of them. And it was migration, yes, but invasion, no. So we've been handed a bill of goods for many centuries right now, and the world has labored under these lies for too long.
Okay, brilliant. Just going back to the extreme antiquity of some of these sites. For example, Avebury, someone that we both know fairly well, Ralph Ellis, has suggested if you look at Avebury from the sky, it is it's like a representation of the Earth, even with the equator going through it. And it turns out that Avebury is 22.5 degrees off north, which just so happens was the angle, the tilt of the Earth 30,000 years ago. So I think there's a very good possibility that whoever built Avebury was basically built a representation of the Earth at that time.
You're right. And that's been corroborated. Similar alignments, phenomenal stuff has been recorded like this. John Michel and others have done this work for many, many generations. And you're right. So this again just backs up this idea that we have devolved. You see, also Professor Alexander Thom, when we were talking about the Irish megaliths, they happen to be the oldest. On the west coast of Ireland and in Ireland in general, the oldest megaliths are to be found. But the thing that Alexander Thom, the great professor, discovered was that they're the most meticulously aligned. All the geometry involved in the Irish megaliths are far more precise than they are anywhere else in the world. And as you move east toward Egypt, although you find many, many megaliths, you find them in Israel, in the Golan Heights, you find them in the Balkans, you find lots in Armenia and Hungary and places like that, but they're slightly less, from a mathematical point of view, slightly less accurate. Nothing to write home about, but nevertheless, the rubric, the rule is that the further west you go, the older the megaliths are and the more precise. So I hang on that. That is then something I cannot step aside. And this then demands, and this has been corroborated by later writers, Christopher Knight, Alan Butler, people like that. So yeah, this is a shocker, and therefore it will demand revision. How much revision? We don't know. I've gone all the way, right, to talk about a west to east movement. It's very unpopular, as we know, but at least some other revision. Other scholars are just going to be forced out of their comfort zones. And it's not to say that some of these east to west movements didn't take place. They did, but these are later in history. These are returns of the descendants of the ancient area that I'm talking about, right? Because they want to go back to their ancient homeland. They've been brought up on stories of it. And some, not all, but some of them hanker to go back again and see what it's like and maybe rebuild. And that's exactly what happens. But it's disingenuous to claim that those returns are the initial and nascent, colonizations of the West. Oh, no, that won't work. But that's been the standard, deception, the big deception that's been purveyed. And of course, it's just like Hitler said, the bigger the lie, the more people believe it and less people question it. But the books that you start talking about with Conor McDorry and Anna Wilkes, and these are a few mighty geniuses who did question it. And, all the greater praise to them for that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. Let's move on a bit now. So you've written that Akhenaten's Atenists were expelled from Egypt and came west. What do you think happened to them?
Oh, well, they moved to several different places. As a matter of fact, a great deal of them never left Egypt at all. They went just to what we would know as northern Egypt, to a place called Tanis, and set up. Not all, but a small remnant. Another remnant went to the Babylon area, and settled in Parthia as well. Parthia plays a big role. If you ever interview Ralph Ellis, you'll be told all about that. It was just kind of Persia. But the more fascinating group was led by Akhenaten's daughter, Meritaten. And she took a group of nobles. These would have been very, very prestigious group that was around her. And they went west. Now, they tried to go back to... What's that?
Scotia. Are we talking about Scotia?
Yes, her nickname was Scotia, which means the dark one, right? Not because of her skin color, but because of her temperament. And they went to Scythia, say the records, and these are Scottish records, by the way. The Scotic Chronicon and the Annals of Ireland tell you all the story about it. They went back to their homeland, Scythia, because they were originally, the Hyksos are Scythians in my book. But when they got there, although they were first welcomed, of course you're going to be welcomed, you're the Empress of Egypt, you're the Empress of the world. But it didn't work out. And so finally they were expelled from their own homeland and they had to go to Spain. And so the history books pick up that they went to Spain, and it's from Spain that they finally crossed over to the ancestral homeland of Ireland. And they weren't welcomed. The first agents that they sent were murdered immediately by the kings that were found there. This earlier branch of the indigenous Irish just went, oh, we know who you are, and we're not letting you in. So they killed the agent. And he's buried in a field in Ireland that's known to historians. But nevertheless, then the Milesians, as they're called, these Atenists, they were known as Milesians after King Miel. The Scots call them Gaithalos. They crossed anyway in force and managed to then, after a few wars, take over a few battles. They took over Ireland. And so the history of Ireland in prehistoric days is then, as you're hinting, was taken over by the Atenists. And that's why many of the crests and arms, including the Ulster flag and what have you, bear their symbols. So that's another premise, so that you get this Egyptian Ireland connection coming to bear as well, which of course is central to my work. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Okay, let's move on, if we can, to Druidism, something that I've find very, very interesting. So what would you say is the relation of Druidism to Christianity? You have written, Michael, that tremendous lies have been told and have referred in negative terms to the Bible. Was the formal inclusion of Christianity by Rome in the 4th century a gigantic stitch-up?
Good question. Well, Christianity is Druidism. Or let's say it's a hybridized Druidism, with elements of this Atonism thrown in. When you go back to the earliest days, you find out actually that Atonism, when Akhenaten invented it, was always opposed to what is another kind of solar cultism called Ammonism. So this is what happened in Egypt. The split between the Atenists and the Ammonists occurred. Ammonism goes back to the dawn of time. It's more ancient than anyone can imagine. Whereas Atonism, of course, is much more recent. And it turned out that the Druids that you're talking about are Ammonists. Or, let's put it more precisely, the Druids of Ireland on the west and the Ammonists of Egypt are one and the same group. Don't be fooled by the terminology, And their symbol was the serpent. That's why you get the adder. And the Druids also called themselves Nadred or Gnadir, right? And you get the serpent priests or the pharaohs using the serpent. It was all the symbol, same iconography when you know what you're looking at. So these were related groups. It's one of the reasons why when I said that the Atenists finally got to Ireland, they weren't well received. Well, of course they wouldn't be well received. They're the enemy. The Irish are in league with the Ammonists and corresponded with them and knew, oh, we know about these people. We know they've been thrown out of Egypt. They're our enemies as much as they are of our Ammonist colleagues over in Egypt. So the Great Fall, this was an apocalyptic battle. And sadly, the wrong side won. And then what you're talking about now is to skip forward. When another group of Atonists that make up the fifth sect of papal Christianity decide to march on Ireland, just in the same way that the Bach Saga says that they marched on Finland. So in an earlier age, you could say about the 9th, 10th century, they now realize that they can't live together, right? The Celtic church, that's largely based on the Druidism, but with that mixture of this kind of Ammonism and also a little bit of a certain amount of admixture of Atonism. Yes, but the Atonists that were in Rome were psychopathic. It's the only way to talk about it. And they just decided that they for 1,000 years, they decided to live, together, side by side. But in the end, that arrangement broke down. And so a war broke out. And this is where Conor McDarry's work comes. We're back to him again because he's the one who really wants to, emphasize this, that it was taken over. But when you take something over, yes, you can destroy it. But in many more cases, you absorb it. And anyone who's done a deep dive into the study of history knows that this is exactly what happened. Today, whenever you see a famous church or cathedral, you know that that's where the pagan site was because they built right over it. Well, it's the same in other contexts as well. You don't destroy it, you absorb it. And so down in the Vatican libraries there under the ground, right, in Vatican City, yeah, you can just imagine what they've plundered from Ireland and Britain. It's extraordinary. In fact, it's a miracle that some of even the legends still, exist in the ancient chronicles of Ireland. And I mention all of those in my books, and I give the citations there. But the upshot of it was that one form of Atonism overtook another form. They have internal squabbles. So it's not about good guys fighting the bad guys. I don't really see it that way. I know that some people do. They like the Celtic church. They like the Chaldean idea, right? But no, the Chaldeans were really Merovingians of Ireland. The Merovingians were sending their princes and their princesses to Ireland for education during this time. They didn't go to Rome for instruction from Rome. They were taking instruction from the Chaldees. Can you believe that? In fact, one of the Merovingians actually married an Irish princess. And this was done at a place called Slane. You can look up Slane Abbey. So the Irish monks who had inherited the wisdom of the Druids by plunder were teaching the Merovingians, the lords, Dagobert, Merovee, all of these people, and all of the what we would later know as the Knights Templar, were being educated by Irish monks who were sitting on top of all the Druidic knowledge. So naturally, if the knowledge of the ancient Druids filters into secret societies like the Knights Templar and Freemasons, all the more that you can understand that it filtered into the Vatican. And it did. So there wouldn't be any. In fact, the word Vatican comes from a meaning of the Druids. Vat can also be rendered fate. F-A-T-E is the Fade or the Vates, who are an order of Druids.
Okay.
Yeah, so we would call them Ovates today. Bards, Ovates, and Druids.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, but the Vates or the Vates are the storytellers or the songwriters, the chanters. and they existed all over the world, not just in Ireland. The one thing, when you're talking about this subject, we sometimes are led to believe we're only thinking in terms of, England and Ireland. No. These Druids were worldwide. I've just said that they were Ammonists in Egypt, are the same group. Well, they were all over the place.
They're very closely linked to the Essenes as well, aren't they?
That's a bit more debatable. I think that the Essenes in my book are more related to the Atonists, actually, but I don't rule out that there was a hybridization there as well, because the influence of the people we're talking about was universal. So there's always going to be, just as there is today, when you see Egyptian elements in Christianity, obviously there was this dispersion as well when it came to the Irish Druids. And in my work on various websites, I go into detail on that and show the citations to show that Constantine and his father, he rejected his father, but his father was the King of England, and it was his father that brought Druidism to Rome. So there's even other anecdotes, of how Druidism, hybridized as it was, corrupted as it was, influenced the founders of Christianity. And the study of the symbolism of the papacy leaves you in no doubt. And my books are crammed with evidence, and my podcasts are clearly, very, very heavy when it comes to that, looking at the different symbolism that originates with the Druids. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You just mentioned that the Irish monks plundered the Druids of their information and teachings and taught it to the Merovingians. But up until this point, I've been rather under the impression that the relationship between the Druids and the very early Christians was a very positive one, if you like, and it was kind of like a natural evolution for the Druids of Britain to kind of merge into Christianity. What would you say to that?
I'd say that is mostly disinformation that's put together by people who, again, reject a lot of what I'm talking about, and have picked up either the wrong end of the stick, benignly, or have an agenda. And believe you me, there's plenty of agendas when it comes to hiding the role of Ireland anyway. And so some of the things I'm talking about would be very controversial. Yeah, I think it was a wholesale plunder. But we know that the Druids were wiped out.
Yes.
And their presence is not in the world. So the way I open my books, I'm not totally closed to what you're saying, but the way I really approach it in the books is that, no, this was a deep conflict, and that there was a battle to the death, let's say, and that the knowledge of the Druids in the West sadly fell into the hands of their enemies. And then this is how I lead up to modern times, to show just how corrupt things have been through the centuries. This is my way of accounting for, some of the obscenities of modern history, really. Okay. This would include the Dark Ages and all the things we know about right up to the modern day.
Okay, thank you for that. Thanks for that perspective. Okay. Have the Irish myths been collected and published, Michael? And you've mentioned Noah as being an Irish king.
Well, I rely so heavily on them that yes, they do feature certain of the myths anyway. Let's say the ones that I found important, like the story of like I said, Nada or Nua, the original king of the Irish, who built the ships to save his people, and we get this turning up in the Bible, with Noah.
Yep.
Yeah, I found that interesting. There are other anecdotes that are turned up in the Bible. The story of King David and fighting Goliath, for instance, is based directly on an old Irish myth. Pertains to the young sun god who killed an evil giant with a sling. That's straight out of Irish mythology. Yeah, we have evidence of extraordinary weaponry that can't be accounted for. They're all bizarre. You see, the ancient legends are just too bizarre for most people to conceive in terms of reality. But there are a lot of parallels. There really are. And people should know about them. This is my thinking.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay. Right, I've got 2 questions left. This one I thought of just before we actually started to record. What is your take on British Israelism? The general consensus on this appears to be very, very divided, to say the least. What would your advice be for someone like myself who's about to start researching this topic?
Well, I would park it until I've read all of Ralph Ellis's work. And I'm telling you this over 35 years of doing it the hard way. I started studying the British Israelites in the early 80s and found it fascinating because it launched my studies, or at least it's one of the threads that I start studying, along with the Celtic mythology, right?
Yeah.
But it leads into so many dead ends. There are some good works that are worth reading for sure. But at the end of the day, there's so many missing pieces. There's so many different chorus of voices that you won't really get anywhere with it. And I was just fortunate enough to come across Ralph Ellis's work. And why I esteem his work so highly is because it is the work that, for me, answered all the X factors that I've been keeping for about 35 years and couldn't find any answer to when it came to this British Israelite question. So I think it's chapter 19 in my book, chapter 19 or 20, what I call the British Israelite Deception. And I walk people through the whole thing. So if you have my book, then, read that chapter. But again, I come back.
Sorry, Michael, are you talking about the Irish origins of civilization?
That's right. Volume 1. Yeah, volume 1, chapter 19, I think it is.
Thank you.
Now, that'll help you a lot. But nevertheless, I would still suggest Ralph Ellis because he has updated many, many different kinds of traditions. And one of the traditions he's massively updated and clarified is this British Israelite thing. It can't be thrown out. There's a lot of wisdom in it, but it needs this connecting tissue. The Holy Blood, Holy Grail books, of the early 80s were help. They definitely need to be read along with this. Things like the Messianic Legacy, written by Bay, Gent, and Lay. So it's not that there's not good books out there that help put those pieces of the puzzle together. There are. But nothing as good as Ralph, because you'll still be left, if you don't have his work, you're still left with these pesky, problems that they just don't fit. No matter how you turn them, there's inconsistency. He's done a magnificent work of being able to sort all of that out through his discoveries. And it's just breathtaking, actually. When I was reading his books, and he wrote one on Scota. You were talking earlier about Scota, Meritaten. He wrote a very good book on Ireland, by the way. Must mention that one as well. But his books help clarify that. So I would say, rather than start plowing through the British Israelite material, I would go to Ralph Ellis first. And then you'll have the real keys of decipherment. And it'll just make it so much easier when you go back into British Israelite work. You won't be snagged. You won't be caught. And you won't be, caught in these whirlpools where you go round and round and round all the time, not being able to make sense of things. So, I always refer to Ralph when we talk about that particular subject.
Okay, well, that's music to my ears because I've interviewed Ralph about 30 times now. I can't get enough of his information. I've read Ralph's 4-part trilogy on Jesus. I've read his first book that he wrote on Thoth, Architects of the Universe.
Right.
A huge fan of Ralph's work.
Good.
Perhaps rather naively, when I started my stream, I was a big fan of Ralph's Jesus thesis, if you like. But I was getting into the idea of Joseph of Arimathea coming to Britain in the last year of Tiberius. But unfortunately, that clashes with Ralph's chronological chasm, if you like, where he has Jesus being crucified at the end of the Jewish revolt AD 70. So I was kind of hoping that I might be able to kind of intermingle the two ideas, if you like, and make them work. But it's proving quite difficult.
Yeah, of course it will be. This is a trouble with, because many of these authors don't see eye to eye, and so you have to use your intuition. You've got to see which one weighs up for you. I had to do the same thing. I've been studying this since the early 80s, and it's been a very difficult journey in the sense that you have to spend many months or even years sussing and rereading and recapitulating before you find out the weight of evidence. Which guy is really coming through. But I think Ralph has done it all in all. Now, that doesn't mean that I completely, agree 100% with everything that he says. We have small differences, but they're so minor. They're so relatively insignificant. And I do talk about them in my articles. I will mention areas where his work and mine, separate. but there's nothing to write home about. They're just small details for readers to realize, this and that difference. But largely, I'm completely on board with his thesis because it straightens things out that you could spend decades, and I literally did spend decades trying to research and go and research, on other books and other people, and couldn't find what I needed. I come across his books, and immediately things start falling into place. So you've got to really credit that.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. Brilliant. Okay, right. One last question, Michael, for you. You've seen a great contest between good and evil played out across history. How would you say is this battle going on at the present time?
Oh, well, there you go. Yeah. Yeah, not well. Not well. I think that our knowledge of evil, in my very first book, I kind of deal more directly with that thesis. And the point that I kind of take is that there'll always be hope. But the thing is, our knowledge of evil is so paltry and so pathetic that we don't have the upper hand or anything like that. So this is an inbuilt handicap to us, because we just don't know enough about pathology and about the nature of evil. That doesn't automatically mean that evil itself will win, because as I advocate in my early work, evil contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. Right? To be evil is, to be out of balance with the moral universe. So the evil has a lot of problems on its hands as well. But when it comes to the world order, the world situation, naturally they have the upper hand. And they will have the upper hand until we are able to get far more knowledgeable about the very nature, the lineaments of evil. And that's quite a journey. That's metaphysical, and it's primarily also psychological, and requires a lot of personal insight, things that we'd rather not do. We'd rather work in the terms of a collectivist movements, and political movements in order to fight evil. And this is not the way to go about it. And therefore, evil in whatever form is always going to be more intelligent, more aware. It'll always have the upper hand until we crack it. And so that's just why my work, especially of later days, is focusing more on human psychology and other subjects. It doesn't mean that I've lost interest in the subjects, that I started with. No, I've just matured them. So that, because these kinds of questions that you just asked are always on my mind. But I think that one of the things, and we've talked about this recently in other podcasts, is that because the human beings today, the millennials, have no concept of history just doesn't exist for them as a subject or an interest, this is a huge, huge problem. Because as somebody said, if you don't know your history, you can't learn by it, and you'll be bound to repeat the mistakes. So this is not encouraging, that people are so dismissive towards their histories. And then there are other cultures who know a lot about their histories. That's why they're bound to be stronger. But in general, it's a rule. If you don't have a history, you can't learn by your mistakes. And if you can't learn by your mistakes, you're going to plow right into the mistakes of the future.
Absolutely.
So this is not encouraging. Now it can be fixed, but the person has to be sincere, don't they? And they have to then do some real homework. And that's not what we're finding. We find a lot of people talking about these subjects, but they don't read. They don't study. They just pretend that they do. Their interest is merely superficial. They spend so much time surfing headlines and commenting on the headlines, and that they're throwing the works of the greats. Great people, great thinkers of the past are being neglected. This is what irks me. And you see, because my belief is that history is truth. History and truth are synonymous words. And there's not a problem that we could possibly face now or in the future that hasn't already been encountered by great minds. Earlier, we talked about Plato, right? And one could go on with the names. So they've already sussed it and solved it for our good. They were thinking of us, but we're not thinking of them anymore. There's been a disconnect. Now, of course, we know who's responsible. This is the schools, but it's also the parents. So yeah, look at our countries. You're in Britain. You're surrounded by history, the megalith, the ancient sites. Everybody in every country is literally surrounded by history, but it's become this, cognitive dissonance. The interest has lapsed, and I wonder what for. What is so damn interesting? See, I'm very interested in history, and especially ancient history. But, well, it's lapsed because our parents don't care about it, and the teachers don't care about it, or want to misrepresent it. It's all about imperialism. It's all about colonization, imperial concerns, and the way they present it is kind of off-putting. But they don't realize what I just said. The man who does not have a history cannot learn from it, and then is bound to make simple mistakes.
What is past is prologue. Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I think from my own perspective, I've got to a point in my life where I want to know where I've come from, who my ancestors were. And I think I agree with you. You're completely right about the younger generation, the millennials, who are particularly targeted by the overlords, if you like. And they're so conditioned now and brainwashed. And it's that generation that I fear for the most, if I'm honest. But at the same time, I'm very pessimistic about I'm very optimistic about the future. I do think more and more people are waking up. So yeah, it's been great experience for me to talk to you, Michael. I really appreciate it. I hope we can do it again. I hope my questions were okay.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much.
Oh, yes.
All the best to you. Cheers.
All the best.
Thank you.